ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ishan Jasuja. I am a research fellow here at the 16th Council. I'm also a master's student in international political economy at King's College London. We are here with panelists, Dr. Mazi Sam and Dr. Shirole, to discuss the status of public-private partnerships in Africa and the role they can play in its development. I hope everyone's had a successful and productive conference so far, and we are ready to add value to it through this discussion. Now, this is going to be a little different from the usual panel discussions that the audience might be used to. This is a virtual policy lab, which essentially means that we are going to have a greater focus on policy formulation, policy recommendation, rather than just diagnosing the problem and leaving it there. I would request the panelists to introduce themselves because I feel that we are in very promising company to achieve our aims for this panel. Dr. Sam, would you please introduce yourself?
All right. It's good morning from Charlotte, the United States, but it's good afternoon in Nigeria, wherever you might be. I want to thank God for the privilege to be here. My name is Mazi Dr. Sam Ohuabunwa. I'm a pharmacist by training, a businessman by vocation. I used to be the CEO of Pfizer Pharmaceuticals in Nigeria and regional managing director for Pfizer in West Africa. I founded NIMET International Business School PLC. It's a sister company to Pfizer Puros PLC in Nigeria. I've been quite active in the advocacy and community well-being. The chairman of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, chairman of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, and president of the Nigerian Employers Consultative Association. And I was last the president of the Pharmaceutical Society of Nigeria. So I have been involved in advocating for growth in African economy, in global economy, in making Nigeria, Africa globally competitive so that we can transit from being permanently a developing or a third world nation to become first world or developed nation. That has been my life passion, and that kicked me into politics in 2023. I tried to run for office as president of Nigeria under the platform of the People's Democratic Party because I stopped at the primary level. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Sam. I do not know if the audience watched it, but you and I had a fantastic fireside chat in precursor to this event, and I hope to build on those conversations and those insights. We are also joined by Dr. Shirole. Would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Thanks, Ishan. Lovely to be here. Mazi Sam, also fantastic to see you, and thanks for your introduction. I'm actually delighted to be here. It's absolutely fun to participate. I don't want to give you my whole CV, but in brief, I'm a professor of strategy and international business with a very keen interest in developmental economics and looking fundamentally at how we can transition from resources to development opportunities within a country space, if you like, and then within a regional space and a national space. And I've always had a keen interest in Africa, particularly looking at East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and then, of course, Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, where I've studied some of the aspects that actually matter to us. And I've always believed that incredible transformative potential for public-private partnerships. And I'm hoping to engage some of my thinking and, of course, the thinking of Mazi Sam in this particular setting and scenario. Thanks, Ishan. Look forward to the session.
Likewise, and especially after learning your interest in the developmental aspects and climbing the value chain from resource exports to manufactured, etc., because the resource curse thesis and the Dutch disease is one of my most researched areas at King's College, and we have a department that dives quite into the details of those. So we look forward to discussing that with you. So before beginning, I think it's a good idea to set the stage for what the public-private landscape in Africa looks like at the moment. And of course, Dr. Sam, you could speak from Nigeria's perspective, and Dr. Shirole could highlight from the East African region as to what is the gap that you think that private sectors could fill? Because I think the multiple governance challenges that African countries face, in general speaking right now, there is an investment gap of, I think, at least quite a few hundreds of billions of dollars. And what do you think the private sector can bring to the table in that respect?
Thank you, Ishan. For me, there is such a huge gap. I told you my life passion. I have a passion to see Africa transit, and Nigeria particularly, from a third world to a first world. And it's clear in my mind that the resources required to accomplish that in the kind of time space cannot be locally generated. The resources are not there, and therefore there is a great opportunity to attract external resources. And that's what creates the huge opportunity for private-public partnerships, especially international private sector. So the gap is huge. The infrastructural gap, particularly, is huge. The social opportunities are there, economic opportunities are there. So I think that the opportunities exist for the private sector to intervene and fill this gap. What is lacking, in my view, if I'm not going ahead of myself, is just the ability of the African nations to understand what it takes to attract this capital, to attract this partnership and sustain it and make it sustainable. That's where I think we have a lot of conversation. And also to win some African countries from focusing on thinking that their budgets can finance anything substantial. The budget, half of the budget is depending on days and a bit of income from natural products and commodities. I'm glad that Professor is talking about moving from resource to development economics. So I believe that if there was one bullet, you could ask me, what is it that Africa needs? What is it that Nigeria needs to flee from this 2% to 1% GDP growth, sometimes less than that, and poor GDP per capita, the poverty in the nations? It is to attract the breaching resource opportunity from the globe and bring it to a country like Nigeria that has the fundamental dynamics that should attract the private sector. So to answer your question, is that the opportunity is huge in every sector, but more so in infrastructure.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Dr. Shirole, Dr. Sam spoke a lot about the importance of commodity revenues or resource revenues and the budgets of African countries. And I was just wondering if you could extrapolate Nigeria's experience, as Dr. Sam has outlined, to the broader region itself and explain to us these resource curse dynamics where, several developmental scholars have pointed out how just the mere presence of commodities and raw materials does not equate to economic development. So if you could highlight that dynamic and how can these countries transcend commodity dependence?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Ishan, there is a real, and thank Mazi Sam for that insight. I think the way I look at it is I look at it backwards. I look at it from the perspective of managerial intervention. Being a strategist for me is both essentially a curse, I think. But fundamentally, when I turn things upside down, I get a better perspective. That perhaps is just me. So when I look at the dynamic of strategy, I look at coherence. And policy and strategy go together, although it's the cart before the horse before the cart or chicken egg scenarios. But if you look at the kind of critical dynamic that's necessary to deliver resource to development or resource to indulgence within a country where that resource is mined, if you like, for the sake of argument, I find that what's really important is to focus on managerial ability, whether it's public sector managers or it's private sector managers. In the private sector, we cry out of our lungs to get people to be involved, get people to understand the functional significance of HR, marketing, all the functional areas, for example. But the pie is so big in government that seldom do we focus on the manager. Everything is about resources, it's about allocation, it's about development, it's about beehiving ourselves in a situation where we seem to compromise our own thinking and do not adapt to what we could be doing. So when I started to indulge in research to identify with some of the challenges I brought it down simply to embedding that thinking at the managerial level. And my colleagues always say these are the three things that Shirole admires the most. But I think there is something that I'd like to share, which is I think managers in the public sector need to be more argumentative. The sad truth is public sector managers are firefighting. They are in great place. And there are some amazing public sector managers, not just manage, but also deliver. So I believe that argumentative element is important, that needs to be invested in. The second thing I believe is, of course, managers need to be reflective. Whether it's public sector managers or private sector managers, absolutely does not matter. What matters is that alongside that argumentative nature, I'd like to also see them being reflective based on the currency of scenarios. Now, it's not the fault of the manager or the administrator or the counselor, for example, within a public sector domain, because sometimes governments change and it's really difficult for them to carry on because policy then suddenly changes. But this happens also in the private sector. When there's a new CEO, things are happening, and Sam probably has that experience and as much as I do. When there's a CEO change, people don't know what's happening. They need to be consoled sometimes, and sometimes they just leave. And this happens in the public sector too. So I think that reflection is important because it's very difficult to look at transition, because the third thing I identify with is managers need to make convincing arguments. It's not just about being argumentative for the sake of it. It's identifying with making those convincing arguments that give us the ability to reflect and indulge in those argumentative kind of scenarios. So if we then come to the concept of what is it that the private sector looks for? It looks for value. And what does the public sector look for? It looks for value for money. And that, I think, is the clear dichotomy. And although it may seemingly appear that both values are the same thing, they are simply different. One, we seek value for profitability, revenue growth. But the other thing is we talk about something completely different, if you like, within the public sector. Okay. If we look at a couple of things that look at across Africa perhaps and see that PPPs have fundamentally altered the landscape in many countries, particularly in Asia, where they've been highly successful. They're the build, own, operate, transfer kinds of scenarios in PPP development. There are other co-developments that have happened within governments. In certain countries, government has just invested huge amounts of money and said, we want to do it ourselves by subcontracting. Whatever the case might be, it's important to see how that happens. And the last point I think that Mazi made, and it's really useful, that is there anything beyond infrastructure that we could see that would be a PPP kind of scenario? Because infrastructure is easy, right? There's a lot of money, attracts private sector, they see their revenue growth and they want to build a bridge because it's profitable, and nothing wrong with that. But what's important also is there are other elements that we can think about at the grassroots where public-private partnerships can come in, and I'm sure subsequently we will talk about it. So at a policy level, I believe governments need to focus on the need for managers to be given the liberty to be argumentative, to be reflective, and they can then collectively form, if you like, the core so that they can make those convincing arguments that define policy within context of deliverance.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing up the grassroots level aspect of it all, because this is very much what I want to get out of this panel and conferences in general, is the grassroots level applicability of the policy recommendations that we make, because we often get lost in these grand narratives with very little benefit or trickle down benefit for the common man on the ground. So that is something that we are looking to change. But before we dive into that, I think it is an important aspect, the other side of the coin, essentially, where we spoke a lot about opportunities in this first conversation. But what about the risks? Now, I look at risk in this arena from two different angles, right? So number one is the risk for the corporations and firms themselves that are entering public partnerships. And there is another lens to look at it, which is risks for the country itself or the government. Because as you said, the incentives of these private corporations are very much profit driven. So how do we essentially ensure that there is value addition for the country itself, or that the country can climb up the value chain and not just end up exporting its natural resources at cheap costs, for argument's sake? So if we could perhaps dive into the nuances of those risks as well, and then of course touch upon the corporations' risks, which is quite fundamental to all of it.
Yeah, super. Mazi, go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. I think if you ask me, I'm sorry if I'm too hard, but That is really the problem of public service, in my experience. You are saying we should have public servants, managers in the public service who think. That's actually what you are trying to say. Whether they are argumentative or reflective, or do they think? Are they not just being reactive and acting like what you call in Nigeria zombie, like robots? My experience is that if you're dealing with a public servant, it tells you, I'm directed to inform you. I'm directed to do this. The question is, who is directing him? Does he have a mind of his own? Can he argue with politicians and political leaders as to what he believes in? I have my doubts. So we really need managers in the public arena who think and who can stand on their own and defend what they believe, so that politicians don't mislead them. Politicians can come with fanciful thoughts and derail an existing program or project. But if you have civil servants who are confident and they know what they're doing, they can argue, as you see, and be convincing, they will be able to prevent them from committing some of the policy somersaults that we do see when there's change of regime in many nations. So let me go back to the issue of risk. I think there are risks on both sides. Again, whether it is investing in infrastructure or, as you said, in community levels, where you're talking about agriculture, you're talking about education, or even industrialization. There are opportunities for people in all these areas beyond hardcore infrastructure, but other forms of economic infrastructure and social infrastructure. So it's not just the hardcore infrastructure, roads, rails, and airlines, but the risks are there. The first risk, I think, is to the private sector organization that is coming up with its arsenal of assets and intellectual property to be able to help deal with a specific problem or help to create a specific infrastructure or expand a specific social sphere. The risk of policy stability, the risk of policy reversals, the risk of temperamental leadership that is flip-flop, changes his mind like the way clocks tick. You find that happening in many nations. There's an ongoing PPP, and then a new government comes into power. They begin to tinker with the agreement or even cancel them. I have an experience. One of the states in Nigeria where the PPP was cancelled. And you won't believe it. This is a PPP the government is a part of. Yet, because the main private sector sponsor did not respond to some of the whims and caprices of the new government, derailing the project. A project that over $200 million have been invested in. So it's a high risk for the private investor. But in this case, I think one of the things that has helped this private sector to minimize the risk is that we tried to get proper legislation that protected him. He insisted on certain legislation. He insisted on certain legal provisions. So I think framing proper legal instruments represent one opportunity to mitigate risk for the private sector operator. For the government sector operator, who also requires a value for the money, I also believe that bringing in third-party institutions, take for example in Africa, if you bring the intermediation of the African Development Bank, or on global level, IMF, World Bank, those Bretton Woods institutions and global institutions that can intermediate and be a safeguard, and it provides some bit of validation. So is it value for money? Is it quality? And also, if financial transactions are being made, that is intermediated by this organization, that monies are released only when certain milestones have been achieved, in which case you also mitigate the risk of private sector getting paid for service not delivered. So my thing is that both sides will need to mitigate risk, and from a private sector perspective, to getting a proper legal framework, and legal frameworks that are also sometimes connected to global legal framework, so that if we can't settle it in Nigeria, we can settle it in the UK or somewhere else where there is a bit of freedom and level playing ground.
I think that's really well to think about the three things you identified, which is validation, accountability, and perhaps mitigation to drive that, and then the legal framework that you identify with. And I think my observations, Ishan, I'm taking the liberty to talk. Is that good?
Please do.
Okay. Because these are really, I would say, the pivotal or fundamental things that make or break PPPs in the grand scheme of things. And sometimes they provide the impetus to do things too. But I think, in talking to what we've been discussing, I think there is a real need for perhaps policy level conceptual framework, because at the end of the day, regardless of who's in power, regardless of their egos, life has to go on for the common man. And that to me should be the single point. So a separation, if you like, of church and state, no pun intended. But I think that is perhaps important. And so that creating that transparency, creating that detailed contract, and understanding that there is a clear agreement that reviews those roles and responsibilities and everything else that goes with the contract. Because I think the Lagos BRT is a classic example where the contracts and the audits fundamentally help both parties look at the transparency element and then, of course, identify with the assessed side of things, which is progress. And then again, the importance of these audits, independent oversight and audit mechanisms need to be in place that allow us to track those milestones, perhaps. And for example, in the SGR project on the Kenya-Mombasa line, there was independent oversight by the Kenya National Audit Office that ensured that there was effective fund management and exactly that, risk reduction. And of course, risk is prevalent and we cannot deny that risk. So for example, I don't know much about the project, but fundamentally I'm aware from a policy level, the Azura Ido IPP essentially saw the government provide sovereign guarantees. And when sovereign guarantees are provided, I believe that reduces currency risk, that boosts investor confidence, and ensures the project's success regardless of who comes to power. And I think that was one of the things that I looked at. The other bit, of course, is it's hard to say that government procurement can be transparent. The amounts are so large, and there is bound to be challenges with the kinds of scenarios that we don't need to talk about in detail, but essentially with a bit of leakage. How do we, at a policy level, strengthen that regulatory and legal framework? Because I believe that it is important to consider that. And so, for example, in South Africa, the waste to energy project, I recall thinking through, offered legal protections via government, that even if there was a government change, that these projects will perhaps go through, and that ensuring that both parties are treated fairly, because ultimately, is there a government project that's come on time and come within budget? There also have to be early warning systems. And so obviously, I think everybody's looking for an ROI, but in the public sector is very difficult to identify with. So I think balancing that need for quick ROI, effective risk management, and government in PPCs is not just about mitigating risk, but it's also about ensuring that the project that is defined is sustainable and transparent. Just to identify with the challenge that happened on the Nairobi to Mombasa project, every person associated with that project who lived along that line wanted the train to stop there. So instead of becoming a direct train from Nairobi to Mombasa, you got 7 or 8 stops in the middle, and that creates those problems. You really cannot avoid that because for all sorts of reasons, and we're not here to debate those reasons. But fundamentally, I believe now with the access to emerging technologies, particularly AI, which I'm assuming we'll talk a little bit about down the road, we can transform policy making in Africa, I believe, in West Africa, particularly Nigeria specifically. And I think historically there's challenges, there's data gaps, there's government issues, there's infrastructure constraints, and all this limits our ability to make those decisions, whether we are government or whether we are private sector organizations. So I think some revolution has to happen, and perhaps, who knows, maybe AI is a way forward. We don't know yet, but maybe. And I believe that perhaps we can create a responsive, transparent, and effective governance structure that will lend itself to that.
Certainly, Dr. Shirole, because your comments right now have very naturally led us to the most important section of this panel discussion, which actually distinguishes it from others of its like. which is the design moment, as we call it. So over the next half an hour or so, we will be looking at the individual policy recommendations that we have come up with so far and identifying newer ones to troubleshoot and neutralize individual policy challenges that we have so far outlined. And emerging technologies, I think we should start with that because that is very much the elephant in the room in policy discussions at the moment. How do you see AI and such new instruments being used as a tool for PPPs coming up in African countries? Because we have to understand that although they may sound like a very creative and a very mesmerizing solution because of their novelty at the moment, it is difficult to apply them in such contexts, don't you think? And what challenges might forthcoming in this arena?
I think it's a balancing act as I see it right now. And the balancing act simply comes from the fact that there are two things I see. One, that AI is perceptibly seen as something that's going to destroy humanity, which is hard. But that's reality, right? And the second one is, particularly in a public sector sense, and if you bring it down, my experience in talking to public sector managers is the public sector is too big. How do I bring it down to my level so that I can deliver the benefits that the public sector is talking about and already eschewing? So to me, back to thinking about the generic value of enabling technologies. Because if you look at countries like Zambia, who were able to leapfrog from the standard telephone line to a mobile kind of scenario, instead of digging and putting poles up and deep grounds and putting cables down, technology simply allowed us to leapfrog. And that leapfrogging in technology is incredibly critical from a government perspective. And I believe there has to be an advisory within the government that allows them to see. And there are a lot of people that I know of African origin that are from Africa who understand West Africa, particularly Nigeria, Ghana, that I have talked to, have a clear idea of how the public sector could benefit from an AI kind of scenario. So coming back to that, there has to be transformation. Otherwise, what's the point in using technology? Because when we look at the revenue savings by mobile telephony or access to technology, our mobile phones now simply are computers, are telephones. They are also cameras. And so when we think about emerging technologies, the kind of problems and challenges that AI can overcome, in my opinion, are the things that historically have challenged us in government. And that is data gaps, governance issues, and infrastructure constraints. And I believe that AI could possibly, if thought through, revolutionize the way governments design, execute, and evaluate projects, which might make the government seemingly more responsive, transparent, and can provide some good, effective governance. Now, it's a mouthful, but I believe that how AI can contribute to policy making, for example, is really useful. And I've got a couple of points that I want to share on that perspective. I'm not an AI expert, but I have an understanding of AI within the context of public policy and how we can drive forward the contributions perhaps that AI can make in as much as how technology makes. I'm privileged enough to be in a generation that transited from mainframe systems to minis to micros, if you like. So I believe now I'm confronted at my age with looking at how AI can contribute to policy making. And it's absolutely fascinating because there are many in my generation that have become Luddites, the proverbial people who do not like technology because they believe change is going to be disastrous. All change is not disastrous. We know that, but let's not indulge that too much. Coming back to how AI contributes to policy making, I think data-driven decision-making is something that we've talked about from the proverbial pulpits of the world and from whatever rock we found that elevates us to high heaven. So when we talk about AI, we can analyze the vast amounts of data. Governments have access to satellite imagery, census data, there's mobile data, so we can uncover certain patterns that are previously inaccessible. And I will give you a very simple example of where we were able to use AI when I was playing within the context of how AI can benefit. I was born in a very small village in India. I left India, privileged enough to have been educated in the UK and in the United States. And fundamentally, now that I live in San Diego, where I'm talking to you from, I find that there is a real dynamic within AI, and I'm trying to investigate and understand the whole thing. Again, I repeat, I'm not an expert. But the value I saw from applying AI. For example, in the little village I was born in, there's only 10,000 people who live there. The number one cause of death for a very long time has been snake bites. The number one cause has been malnourishment to a point. But the biggest challenge out of all of that was tragically women welfare, prenatal, postnatal care. And so we were able to model, we were able to identify, we were able to sort out how we could develop not programs, but a model that would make recommendations to government to sort out the problems. And one of the great things that we were able to pull together and think through in our heads as a team, and I was only a part of that team, was simply that a primary care center would be able to deliver an ambulance to everybody within 3 minutes. And this is something AI could come up with. And we could map the whole region. Again, it's a small town, so 3 minutes is a possibility. And using some of the fallout from our looking at the policy gaps, looking at the transparency challenges we had there, we were able to eliminate all of that and provide a successful primary care center for women to go in for prenatal and postnatal care. And we were then able to take it forward using AI technologies to see how AI could help us outline specific benefits that we could accrue to these people. This can be done. I was privileged enough to work in Ghana, where the biggest problem was alcohol in the remote areas where access to technology was completely out of the question. But we're not talking about some grand things. We can talk about small things that make people productive enough to contribute to the GDP. And that's all we're trying to look at. And I believe PPP can do that. And I think there are some real fundamental things that we can look at it from a transformative sense, from the very basic characteristics of AI that we can actually deliver. Demand forecasting, risk monitoring, early monitoring systems that we've been able to put together for farmers within the area. And then, of course, we can look at the big words like policy optimization and simulation. They all sound scary. And to any government person, they are even scarier. So I think that we can probably do that. One of the things that I think all developing countries, particularly in the global south, affected by is corruption. I can definitely help to some degree in reducing, perhaps tracking public procurement, perhaps identify patterns of irregularities, perhaps. And it's important in enhancing that transparency, which governments always look for within the policy.
Thank you for the comprehensive introduction to the theme of digital governance. And I think, as you rightly mentioned with India, I speak to you currently from Hyderabad in South Central India, and few countries have mirrored the way in which India has deployed advanced digital technologies for public governance in terms of bridging gaps all the way from data collection to optimization of the governance itself. Dr. Mazi Sam, if you could please highlight from your experience in Nigeria, and since you've worked so closely with businesses in leadership roles, and of course in the public policy space as well with all of your advocacy, if you have championed the idea of Nigerian growth such as yourself. So how do you see emerging technologies spearheading that in this very critical phase for developing and emerging economies?
To be sincere to you, first, Professor Rajendra, I thank you for eventually calling the word you've been trying to escape from. You've been avoiding corruption. You've been avoiding that word. You're sketching around, giving it different names. I'm glad you landed there. To be sincere, my belief, and that's why, because of what Prof said earlier on about creating a thinking public sector. I'm sorry, but my experience is that there is not enough intelligence in the public sector in Nigeria and some other West African nations that I have worked in. There's not enough intelligence. So artificial intelligence will fill the gap. So for me, that's the number one benefit. Some thinking, some mental rigor will come into work. As I said before, my experience of public sector managers is that they are reactive. They are zombies. They just follow orders. They can't face anybody. But when you're dealing with artificial intelligence, does not look at your face. It's algorithms that think beyond, out of the box, and they're able to give you facts and figures and things you can't deal with, and they don't care your feeling. So I think that we need, if Africa needed anything to leverage on the competence of its output, and input and output, AI and such technologies, what we should be clapping for. However, to optimize it, we need some demographic change in leadership. If we have leaders like Professor Rajendra is a little bit ahead of us because I think I'm older than he is. And therefore, they're not adaptive. They're not very friendly to technology. They actually have for creating doomsday options. But the younger elements are more familiar with this. So I think for us to optimize the impact of AI and new technology, there must be demographic change in leadership. We should bring younger people or push them up. Let the older people take more backward seats and advisory positions. It is critical for us. If we come to Nigeria, where the 70-something-year-old, 80-year-old are ruling the country, we can understand the type of challenge they will have in absorbing and imbibing and accepting revolutionary technology and its application in dealing with government issues. So I can see a lot of opportunities for AI and new technologies in bringing the thinking that we're talking about, in bringing creativity, in bringing innovation, in helping to solve virtually every problem. Nigeria and African countries have issues, too many of them. So to be able to reach remote areas, even to be able to fight battles, look at insurgency, look at terrorism, AI and new technologies offers them opportunities. We are talking about unmanned territories, and that is opportunity for terrorists to penetrate into countries. If you have proper drones, proper sensors using new technologies and AI, if you can see the terrorists 10 miles away, you can activate your defensive mechanisms and defensive strategies. So if you ask me, I think Africa should embrace AI once and all. But to be able to do so, we must also be deliberate in allowing younger people opportunities to stand at the interface.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you for outlining those because I completely relate with the point about using AI and emerging technologies in defense. Who knows more about terrorism than us right now in India? That's something that we are grappling with quite closely at the moment. But I just wanted to get your opinion on how these technologies can be homegrown because we're talking about the design moment of the panel discussion over here, and we need to ensure that, as we were talking about in the initial stages, that we need to apply these policies to the grassroots level. And when you talk about such things as AI driven weapons, or even in the case of predicting patterns in agriculture, etc., or other sectors of the economy, it's mostly advanced companies from the global north coming in and then imposing those technologies and charging royalties, etc. So my question is, how do you see these emerging technologies or this cutting edge instrument being developed within African economies themselves? How do you think this can be homegrown and domestic led growth?
For me, the first thing is let us get into partnerships. Again, PPP model. I want to introduce a particular technology and I have an original equipment manufacturer or a company that is or at the cutting edge. I would invite them to the country, but I agree that they partner with locals so that there'll be a bit of learning and transfer, because reinventing the wheel can be expensive, but if the wheel has been manufactured or it is already invented, the best thing is to see how to adapt it. So we need to have access to the wheel and then see how we can adapt it. So my first proposition is that African nations should enter into PPPs and partnerships with technology companies. Number two is that there should be an investment in creating the skills, in creating the knowledge that is required. Again, this is where I'm going back to my demographics of young people. If you come to Nigeria, there are so many hubs, so many tech hubs that have been created, and young guys are doing marvelously well. What they need is incentives, some bit of investment by government at relatively low cost, and then they can get a lot more coming from an indigenous point of view. Of course, they can also acquire these skills outside by deliberate training or scholarship or skill upskilling program that will take young Africans to Silicon Valley, in India, in the US, in such hotspots of innovation and acquire these skills. Luckily for us, technology skills fast absorptive. They don't take generations to acquire. They are acquired over a short time of concentration. The important is to understand how to apply the algorithms and the logical and the framing of the thought process in technology and AI. And then you can then translate it to your own environment and to your own specific problem. I've seen some labs in Lagos where young boys are already doing things in micro levels using artificial intelligence, divining them, solving certain problems, some of which were like what Professor just talked about, solving problems in villages and in remote places. So there are three methods. First is buy it if you can afford it. Two, develop it locally. Thirdly, go out and acquire it and bring it home. So by a combination of these three methods, we can leverage, and Africa can catch up with development. Look at what you talked about telephones. In Nigeria, before 1999, there are only 400,000 working lines, 400,000. Before 1999, by 2010, there are over 100 million lines. Who could have ever thought that was possible if we didn't have mobile telephony technology? So Africa should be happy. The less resourced world, the less developed world should be happy that technology is helping to bridge the development gap. And again, because of the level of innovation and obsolescence, costs are originally primarily high, but they soon become affordable. When cell phones came, they were for the rich. But now every old woman in every village in Nigeria has access to mobile phones. So it is to have a paradigm shift in the way we look at things from a leadership perspective, both private and public, and be welcoming and absorptive and adaptive in technology utilization.
Certainly. And Dr. Shirole, what role do you think transfer of technology and skill building can play in just that you have studied?
Yeah, I think thanks, Mazi Sam, for your input on that. Just to show that I'm worth my salt, I'm going to look at education. There is a real formula that I worked out in my brain. And I believe it takes anywhere from 8 to 10 years to create a transformation within the context of a government and in the context of delivering something. We talk about AI. We do not give enough, if you like, credence to the younger generation, because as we get older, we think we know it all. I speak for myself. I believe that the younger generation is not just hungry to find ways in which they can influence their environment, but they're also hungry for knowledge. And COVID taught us lessons, taught me a huge lesson. Because on a Friday afternoon, when I was told that we are not going to meet, this is March 9, and on March 11, I had to go and do a class and deliver to 150 people online. I'm very honest with you, I was scared to no end. How are we going to do this? But when I started thinking about content and I forgot about me, I was able to create very quickly an experience that students actually loved. And this is not just my experience. This was experience of colleagues that were doing this or were forced, if you like, or their hands were forced or their face was forced to be on a screen. So what they were saying was, and their evaluations were showing that they were actually better teachers online. Can you believe that? My thinking is that if we can create with global talent, whether it's talent from India or the United States or Europe or from Sam's area in the Northeast, which I have the privilege of living in as well, we find that there is a real element of a rethink. And to me, that has to be the policy. Education amazingly breeds success. And I believe there are amazing people, young people who are creative, who are argumentative, and who can deliver to what it is that the calling is within the context of how technology can deliver. And I believe if we take some top universities, yes, in Lagos, in Abuja, and all kinds of other places, we can create excellence centers that allow for this development. And you're not going to see the benefit in 1 or 2 years, but over time, 5, like I said, 8 to 10 years, but starting at about 5, you will see development that allows for this policy debate to be seemingly successful. And not just seemingly successful, but actually it can deliver success. And to me, that is one way to identify with and question that, because governments have to rethink their propositions around risk, around policy capture, around defining and making weaker local ecosystems powerful, and increase resilience in the system. So I think there is a real element that we need to understand. And I believe governments can invest. A government like Nigeria can invest money in education directed toward a policy debate that allows the younger generation to take hold. And we should forget about our thinking and let this younger generation think. And it actually works. Because in my experience in working in Ghana, no government person had gone and talked to the women about their problems. So very quickly, this is real intelligence on the ground, right? That we talked to the women and the women said, we come home on a Friday, but our husbands or other significant halves have actually drunk all the money and they're laying in a gutter somewhere and we have to fend for our babies because they don't have any food. It's a gut-wrenching kind of thinking. So how can you bring power to these people? Because the one thing that we decided to do was bring power to these women so they can control their lives and make money themselves. Because they were relegated to pounding what we call ugali in Kenya and pounding the grain to make the food for these people. And so how could we reduce that pressure so they don't have to go and look for firewood or have some pocket money, that they could make their own decisions? And believe you me, in work in 7 centers, it was amazing. But who did we convince? We convinced the local politicians to see how they could provide an upliftment for these people who are suffering. It doesn't just need AI. AI is only a tool. People are looking at AI as some God-sent deliverance that is going to deliver us to some unbelievable space and allow us the opportunity to live on Mars. Let's think real. Let's think basic and let's deliver to that. And that is why I am here, because I am really keen, and I'm sure Sam input those two. So my thinking is, let us understand the problem. And I believe whatever it is we are going to use, we're only going to be able to leapfrog if we understand the problem. And to Mazi Sam's example, which is with the technology leapfrogging, where 100 million Nigerians were able to access technology in 2010 compared to less than a few million 10 years before. So this is the kind of thinking that we need to have. What is it that makes technology accessible, affordable, engageable, if I like to use a crazy word, but there you go. So this, I think, is something critical that we must all focus on, so that we can focus on technology transfer, we can focus on the ecosystems, we can focus on policy capture, and we can increase resilience to the challenges that we find from economic and perhaps even operational shocks that can be generated.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good long-term view to conclude the design moment on. But before I wrap up, this is my last question to you. We've spoken at length about policy solutions that may be adopted to the several challenges that we have outlined. What do you think would be the next immediate quick win that is going to boost spirits in this arena?
Oh, wow. Sam, I'll let you start.
I believe that a little bit of peer pressure may be helpful. A little bit of information sharing. This is why I think that opportunities created by organizations like the African Union and such international organizations could be helpful, because so very often African, and I'm speaking with my African background, African leaders sometimes are more adaptive or more willing to listen to experts from outside the immediate region than people talking to them from the local point. So I would think that the international organization, AU, should step into advocating for this kind of thinking and this kind of change to be able to be realized. Nigeria, Africa used to have this NEPAD. I don't know whether it is still functional or active, but those are the kind of institutions that I believe can be helpful in pushing this agenda forward. Secondly, I also believe that the increased use of the opportunities offered in the social media for individual contributions, because what I'm focusing a lot is how do we move the needle. All that we have said today and more we're going to say tomorrow will require somebody to take action. And it's usually from a policy perspective, it is the public sector that has the resources and the legal equipment to enforce actions and set policies. So my experience is that they are more lethargic. It's always more difficult to push them along. The political class we have in some African nations are very selfish, self-centered, narrow-minded, and corrupt. So their thinking often may not be in consonance with what we are saying, how to optimize a global, national, regional growth. I'm sorry to say so, but it doesn't quite always fit into their thinking. As an academic, as Prof is, a private sector essential person, we're altruistic, we're idealistic, we're looking at what is best that will grow the economy for everybody. But my experience with the little time I got close to achieve that, especially the African Nigerian model of positions, you'll be surprised that most of the time they're not talking in this language. They are speaking other things that are not related to them. So when you bring up this subject, they don't have enough time to listen to you. They'll be looking at their time, and you lose concentration by even their body language. So my focus is how do we get the African leadership, political leadership, the public sector leadership to respond? And I think we should bring all the forces that cannot them into shape. That's why I'm thinking of international or multilateral or such kind of groupings to put some force in hoods on them to behave.
I think to Mazi Sam's point, it's amazing what we can achieve because governments need to create a policy dependence, thinking about it backwards. They also need to understand economic fragility in that process. How services, for example, are disrupted. And when domestic anchors are weak, there's bound to be disruption. When port infrastructure is bad, ships stand outside of the port and things have to be transshipped, which is a very simple metaphor for scenarios. But I believe that policy recommendations are critical. I believe local content frameworks we need to identify with and strengthen. We have to prioritize the local value chains because ultimately they deliver. We need to look at procurement training for people within government that allows for less leakage, perhaps. The other bit, of course, is access to finance. And this is something where educational institutions become the epicenter of development, where there can be a vested element that the government can invest in, allowing for the proliferation, if you like, of small and medium enterprises, or what in Africa we call MSMEs, the micro and the medium and small enterprises. And then the other bit, of course, is creating this element of building capacity and readiness for situations and scenarios. And things like providing bid preparation support because we want quality bids to come in, creating these PPP innovation hubs that have been extremely successful in countries in South Asia. And then, of course, matchmaking, because at the end of the day, governments need to allow for that matchmaking to happen. And this happens naturally if platform is provided through educational institutions to actually do that. But largely, to Sam's point, there has to be an institutional and legal reform. Without that, I don't think we can deliver the PPP experience. So there has to be a certain hands-on yet hands-off approach from government by delegating to educational institutions, perhaps, or even private sector organizations, this element of creating inclusivity, creating independent content, creating audits that are successful. And lastly, I think is something we talk about in the private sector, which can also talk about from a public sector standpoint, which is reward and regulate. And what I mean by that is offering incentives. We offer incentives to people to complete a bridge in double quick time. Why can't we offer incentives to educational institutions to do better than they are doing, and by showing that they actually can, right? So there has to be some creativity in that deliverance, and that's a policy level scenario. The other bit is, of course, come up with penalties for non-compliance and ensure that the local content rules are met, which are identified with. And lastly, I think, how do we create transparent public dashboards that allow for a verifiable, auditable environment that allows for measuring inclusivity within a community, for example? And this is partially happening in Africa. Let's not say that this has to happen in Africa now. It is happening. If you look at Africa 50, the Project Development Fund, it's absolutely amazing. It talks about a challenge, but it's got a barrier: lack of bankable funds. There is no allocation of resources. The other bit, of course, how can we create early stage funding to make participation? And something that I've been associated with in my village, to see how we can get an ambulance company to provide the ambulances that are necessary for ambulatory care within that context. And political risk, we started talking about it, right? And there are those challenges we cannot. But how do you de-risk politically volatile environments? And Nigeria is reasonably stable within that stage, and so is Ghana, and so is Cote d'Ivoire. But we can think about those kinds of things. But I believe there also is the need for creating public-private infrastructure advisories that are vested in people, outside people like Mazi, for example. And I don't want to put my name in it because that would be greedy. But this is what is so important, is the public-private infrastructure advisory facility can reduce barriers, it can create solutions, and provide impact. Because barrier, solution, and impact are the three things, again, that are critical to understand things like volatility, things like financing, things like local currency debts that can be highlighted and identified within PPP projects, or how can we overcome some of the foreign exchange risks? Should we work with a foreign entity to deliver some of these challenges? And then lastly, impact, which is encouraging domestic financing and long-term local currency bonds, for example, for roads, energy, hospital, primary care centers, educational institutions, and the like. And I think that is incredibly critical. And it can be done. It has been done. And I don't see any reason why Nigeria will not be able to do that within the context of things that we've been able to talk about.
I understand. I would, to conclude, firstly begin by thanking our panelists, Dr. Sam and Dr. Shirole. This has been unprecedented level of insight on this, well, very critical theme at a very timely moment, I must say. And we've spoken about all the way from the political risks of public-private partnerships, both highlighting the nuances of the risks faced by the state, the countries themselves, and of course the foreign firms and domestic firms that may engaging in those partnerships. The solutions highlighted have also been quite nuanced in terms of differentiating between what needs to be done on a long-term structural level that will eventually help African economies overcome the resource curse and reduce commodity dependence, and of course on the more immediate level with the involvement of multinational development banks and international institutions that can really spearhead accountability and democratization of PPPs in the continent and the countries within. So I really thank both of you for your time and your insights, and of course for the audience for listening so patiently. We really look forward to the outcome document from this, which is going to be a nice policy brief outlining all our discussions and all the recommendations that this panel has made. And of course, look at the grassroots level applicability, which has been the overall focus of this. Thank you very much once again.